So we got the recording going, which is the most important part. Yeah, so we'll see if any more people join. 80 might be what we got right now, but I just want to thanks everyone who registered and who's attending this event. This is all made possible from the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. So we're very grateful that we're able to offer these sessions for free for everyone to attend, and specifically to educate folks on the very important discussions that are going to be had from beginning today and all the way till the end of December. And I am for one, I'm very honored that we're able to start it with someone that I've known in my, just in my world very much for it's been a while now. I would say, I've known Celina for quite a bit, and she's really been a great influence on my life in particular with a lot of the community work I've done for the past 5 years or so. And also very much with the aspect of reconnecting to the Indigenous community, and specifically, of course, the Indigenous community in St. Albert, Sturgeon County, and even in the Edmonton area. We've done a lot of work together in the past. We've gone to a bunch of schools, schools in the St. Albert School Division, St. Albert Catholic, once again, Sturgeon School Division, even in Edmonton, government organizations, nonprofits. We've worked really hard together, and once again, just I'm very appreciative that we're able to start this first, as we call it, the Indigenous education sessions with Celina, because she has a lot to share and there's a lot to learn from her. When I talked about the work that we've done, we do lots of blanket exercises together. In particular, in each one of those sessions, we would have a talking circle at the end. And each time we would have one of those ones, it's always something new to learn from Celina and her story, and just the perspectives that she has to share, specifically on what we're talking about today in that regard. So I'm just very, once again, just very honored. She's a good friend of my mom. And I definitely, as we put it in our communities, right, she would be someone that I would consider, part of my family in that regard, 110%. And you may not be able to see him, but her husband Daryl is there, and same thing, very, very much very knowledgeable person, and just very grateful to have her here.
Well, thanks for having me, Josh. I'm really excited to be here. I just want people to know that Josh did offer me proper protocol before we did do this session. So I'd just like to say thank you for that. And I'm really glad to be here. I'm going to let you get on with the introductions here and your little part, and I guess we can get going.
Yeah, and I do see, someone did already raise their hand. If you do have any questions or anything like that, feel free to put them in the chat box. We do have Kayla here. She's here ready to get any questions down or comments or anything on that regard. Any tech problems she should be able to assist you with, or at least help you in some way. And she's also been the assistant on this project. So she's worked very hard to really help me build the foundation for this session that we're doing. So I'm very grateful that she's able to join us today and be able to provide that support with this first session. So as I say, these sessions, they do come from they come from the Center for Race and Culture, and they have been made possible from the Canadian Race Relations Foundations from a grant that we applied for. So very grateful for that. And once again, that we're able to provide these for free, and for anyone who just specifically wants to learn on what we're going to be talking about specifically for the past couple almost few months, actually. Now I think about September, October, November, December, we've got 4 actually there. So we call these, and when it comes to this word, I'm definitely going to have to talk to Ruben and Ruben Quinn, who's the Cree instructor at Center for Race and Culture, and get those wonderful in-person lessons to figure out what's I have an idea, like the âpahkowâyânaw âpahkowâyânaw, and I don't know if that's the proper way to pronounce it in that regard, but as a language learner, I speak it's what they call Southern Michif. I'm always interested in learning new languages and figuring out pronunciations. So I'm very excited actually to have one day, maybe just sit down with Ruben, chat with him on the phone or in person, and being able to learn about this word and learn how to pronounce it. And generally what it translates to is like our minds are clear in that regard. And it kind of fits into these discussions that we're having because when it comes to these discussions, just put it simple, when it comes to me and Celina, they're very personal to us in that regard. A lot of times we're putting ourselves in vulnerable positions when we talk about these kind of topics, because it's a lot of times it's the stories of our families in that case. So it's very, very personal in that regard. But we're very grateful that you are all here and wanting to listen and learn and just figure out ways that we can be better with each other in that regard. This is a really wonderful opportunity to do that. And as I say, they're specifically called Indigenous education sessions. So specifically, if you're wanting to learn more, these are the sessions absolutely to attend in that regard. And all of you're going to be provided with a resource list in that regard. All this recording, it's being recorded in that regard. So you will be able to view this after too, which is really wonderful. And there are more things in planned. I can't say specifically what it is yet. We're going to have more meetings on it, but there's going to be more things planned in regard to this project so that it lives beyond the time frame that we've kind of put in that sense, which is really, really cool to think in that case. So this one is on the Indian Act. It does say obviously August 24th, but there was a little bit of a situation. Thankfully, everything is okay and we're all good. So we're able to do it now on August 31st, which is still on a Tuesday, which we're really grateful. And as I say, this one is with, as they put it, Mrs. Celina Loyer. She's the Aboriginal Programmer at the Musée Héritage Museum. And I guess like even for me, right, like I haven't even really introduced myself, but that's okay because we're still here at the beginning. But for me in that regard, before we get on to the land acknowledgement here, my name is Joshua Morin. So Tanshe Kiwao, Josh Morin de Shinakashun, Mr. Sagan, Pay Manitou Sagan Doschin in Michif Nia, and Ni Pikashwan Linang Michif. So hello everyone, my name is Joshua Morin. My family comes from the historic communities of St. Albert and Lac St. Anne here in Alberta. And I use their traditional names always to introduce those communities, just to honor that long history that has existed in those communities and to honor people like my family and Celina's family that are still very much living in those communities today. And our presence is absolutely there. I always introduce those names with their traditional names. Mr. Sagan for St. Albert, meaning Big Lake. Manitou Sagan for Lac St. Anne, meaning Spirit Lake or God's Lake. That's through my mom's side. My dad, he's also Métis. He comes from Meadow Lake, Saskatchewan, and he was actually born in Hay River in the Northwest Territories. And our family is quite spread about, like most Métis families and most Indigenous families. You'll find we have cousins in places that we might not even expect in that regard, but it's really cool in a lot of cases. I am the new Indigenous Education Specialist for CFRAC, the Center for Race and Culture. I'm very honored to join the team and being able to just provide any perspectives that I can, and also being able to facilitate projects like these and making sure that we're able to provide them to the public. And when I was approached and they said this is the project that we had, I was like, we can absolutely do this. And I know the folks that we should contact to come and speak, such as Celina that we have today in that regard. So that's basically kind of a brief rundown of me. I am quite well connected in the Indigenous community. I've been doing community work for the past 5 years. My grandma was Thelma Shalafu. She was the first Indigenous woman appointed to the Canadian Senate. So I've had a very interesting upbringing myself, growing up knowing we're Métis, growing up in a political family too, just because of who my grandma was. But what we're talking about today and the issues that we're going to be talking about for the past few months now that we're going to be discussing, they have been discussions that have been around me for a long time in that regard. So very comfortable when it comes to speaking on these, but also I see the importance and the need to have these discussions. So once again, just very grateful to be the Indigenous education specialist at the Center for Race and Culture. And I'm very grateful that we're able to do a project such as this. So when it comes to the land acknowledgement, the Center for Race and Culture recognizes it is located on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland for the Métis Nation. And this image here comes from a website called nativeland.ca. And it's a really cool website. You can actually see the treaty territories on kind of like a Google Maps almost kind of platform in a sense, which is really fascinating. So this gives you kind of a good image of what Treaty 6 looks like and the size of it. It's not just here in Alberta, but it absolutely stretches well into Saskatchewan and all that kind of stuff. So that's the treaty territory that we are currently situated on. And of course, it is also the homeland for the Métis Nation. So the Center for Race and Culture, if this is your first time, for over 25 years, the Center for Race and Culture has brought together a diverse people with an interest in promoting and supporting individual, collective, and systemic change to address racism and encourage intercultural understanding. Our staff, board, and members bring a range of expertise and experiences to their work with our organization. What we believe is that our work at the Center for Race and Culture is guided by our vision and mission statements. And what is our vision and mission statements? Well, our vision is to create an inclusive society free of discrimination and racism. And our mission, the Center for Race and Culture works within the community to advocate and support individual, social, and systemic change to address racism and discrimination and increase intercultural understanding. Our expertise spans workplace development, community building, research, and of course, what we're here today for, education. So that's kind of a quick rundown on the organization. So today here, we're specifically here to discuss about the Indian Act, and how it's going to work is I'm kind of just going to give folks a brief rundown in a sense of kind of like what the Indian Act is. And then Celina, she's going to talk about literally in a sense what the Indian Act is, but in a sense like how it actually affects First Nations person like on a day-to-day basis in that sense for their whole life. Like this is how the Indian Act has affected us in that regard. So the Indian Act started in 1876, and it absolutely still exists today. It's actually still part of Canadian law in that regard. So to start off, who are the three Indigenous peoples of Canada recognized under Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution? So you have First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. It's always very important to start discussions with this. To me and Celina, we have always kind of gone around and said to us, this is basic knowledge in that case, knowing who the three Indigenous peoples are of Canada. But the reality is there's a lot of people that still, they actually still don't know in that case. In some cases, they're saying, wow, Canada has Indigenous peoples in that case. So they're still just realizing that there are Indigenous peoples here in Canada. And it's like, well, yes. And the ones that are recognized under Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution are the First Nations, the Métis, and the Inuit. And, we could have a whole discussion even on that aspect on the recognition process in that case. But it's just important to know today that the First Nations, there's over like 600 plus First Nations across Canada in that case. And that's kind of that's who we're going to be talking about today when it comes to the Indian Act. And then you have the Métis, who are, basically, my people, and Celina too. Celina's Métis also. in that case. So she has a very interesting perspective when it comes to that, but it's really cool in that case, you know. So you have the Métis, you know, we lived in the Northwest, we still live in the Northwest, you know, you probably heard of Blue Riel, Dumont, Cuthbert Grant, and even here in Alberta, long Métis history. Even if you look at the formation of the Métis Nation of Alberta, they started as the Métis Association of Alberta back in like 1930 or 1930s or late 1920s in the basement of the church in St. Albert. So there's a lot of Métis history here too. And then of course the Inuit, you know, people live up north, and kind of a fun fact with this one is that sometimes people will say Inuit people in that regard. But the reality is if you say Inuit people, you're saying the people, because Inuit means people in that case. So when they say the Inuit, they means the people very much. So that's kind of a quick little fun fact, but a cool thing to know in that case, because when you encounter someone who is Inuit, you can just say like that, oh, you're Inuit in that case, or you're, you know, and rather than saying, you know, you're you know, an Inuit person or the Inuit people in that case, then it's like people in that regard. So when it comes to like what is the Indian Act, I found two interesting definitions. One that was put out from the Native Women's Association of Canada, and then one that was put out from the Canadian Encyclopedia, which I was kind of surprised because I was like, is that website ran from Indigenous peoples, you know, coming from my brain, but it was actually a pretty good, decent definition in that sense. But of course, with these definitions, we're going to be talking about so much more once we get to Celina's aspect. So the Indian Act was created to control and assimilate Indigenous peoples and their communities. Throughout history, a number of shocking discriminatory measures have been in place. That was from the Native Women's Association of Canada, also referred to as NWAC. And then you have the one from the Canadian Encyclopedia that says the Indian Act was created in 1876. The main goal of the act was to force the First Nations people to lose their culture and become like Euro-Canadians. The Indian Act has been changed many times and does not affect either Métis or Inuit. When it comes to Métis specifically, there's a whole history on the script in that case. When it comes to, you know, expanding more on what is the Indian Act. The Indian Act was not part of the historic treaty signed between First Nations and Canada, but was Canada's legal response to them, which is kind of interesting when you look at it from that perspective. While negotiations were continuing in the West with Indigenous peoples, this legislation was passed without negotiations. And this would have deep and long-lasting impacts on First Nations within Canada. The purpose was to encourage assimilation. So enfranchisement is a very interesting topic, and these are two segments from the Assembly of First Nations that kind of give folks a bit more understanding. And the reason why I'm bringing these topics up is because when Celina has her, when she starts talking about her story, she's going to be using terms like enfranchisement, and this gives you an idea of what that is. So before Bill C-31, before the Bill C-31 amendments in 1985 took place, enfranchisement was the process that resulted in a First Nations person no longer being considered an Indian under federal legislation. First Nations who were enfranchised were removed from their ban list, and First Nations also lost their Indian status if they were enfranchised after September 4th, 1951. And this was before the Bill C-31 amendments in 1985. When a First Nations person was no longer considered an Indian, when that person was enfranchised, he or she lost all benefits associated with being on the ban list pre-1951 or being status Indian after 1951. Their descendants were not considered Indians and they could not receive any related benefits. This impact is still felt by current generations. So it can seem like quite a bit, right? Like when you read this can seem like quite a bit. So you can only imagine if you were like the First Nations person in this situation. And it's kind of like, this is the whole process. And it's just like, you know, like, wow, in that regard, you know? So who does this affect? Of course, as we're talking about, the Indian Act specifically affects First Nations. The First Nations are the original peoples of what we now call Canada. First Nations include status and non-status First Nations, and there are more than 630 First Nation communities in Canada, which are represented by more than 50 nations and by 50 Indigenous languages. So that's very important to know, because not all First Nations people are the same in that sense. You know, there's a lot of diversity even within the First Nations. If you go to, you know, the coast of BC, you're going to see a difference from the Cree here in the plains here, and then you're going to see a difference if you go to the Haudenosaunee in the Great Lakes and that area. You know, there's a difference between us, and in that case, and even just those names, like you have Coast Salish, you got the Nehewa Cree, the Haudenosaunee, like they all have their specific names even to recognize themselves in. So this is generally here what we're going to be focusing on today. This was a graphic that I found on Twitter, and it was really, really wonderful, actually. It comes from that book, 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act by Bob Joseph, and it was created by, I imagine this fellow is some kind of graphic designer. His name is Michael Muhammad. Also on Twitter, Michael_TDSB. And this kind of gives you a brief rundown of what the Indian Act did. Like, as it puts 21 things you may not know about the Indian Act. Interesting thing, if you're someone who's First Nations or someone who's, you know, very knowledgeable on, you know, what took place with the Indian Act, this might also be read as 21 things you obviously know about the Indian Act in some ways, because they lived that experience in that sense. But of course, coming from that other perspective of, you know, you never heard about the Indian Act, you didn't even know that people could lose their status in that case. This is a really wonderful graphic, and the book too by Bob Joseph, I would 100% recommend to read. It's only, like, if you get the audiobook, it's only around 3 hours or so. It's a really quick and easy read, but the information there is really good, actually. Like, you can learn a lot from it. So, you know, just looking at a few things, right? Like, number one is it denied women status, right? So it was sexist in that case, and a lot of cases still is in some cases. And then you have introduced residential schools, created reserves, renamed individuals with European names, could expropriate portions of reserves, enforced enfranchisement of any First Nation in university. So that too, if they wanted to seek education, they would be forced to lose their status. Restrict First Nations from leaving reserves. They instituted what they called the pass system. And, you know, like, they could not even form political organizations, right? So we couldn't even politically organize to try to better ourselves as a people in that regard. You know, our cultural ceremonies were illegal. Wearing cultural clothing was prohibited. You know, denied voting rights up until the 1960s. Could not use our own languages. These were all included in the Indian Act here. So this, once again, this is a really wonderful graphic. The book is really good to read. I would recommend reading that book. And this is probably where I'll probably stop where I'm at right now, and I'll probably put it over to Celina in that regard, just because she's very important and wonderful knowledge to share today in that regard. So I'll stop the share.
Okay, thank you, Josh. That was a great intro. I'm going to talk about a lot of the same things. So I do have a PowerPoint that I also want to share with everyone that I put together here. See if I can make this thing share. Me and tech, it's always an interesting thing with me when it comes to technology. So I am going to share this slideshow from the beginning here. Oh, and I can't see all right, that's okay. I don't need my notes. All right. So my name is Celina Loyer. Tanse, Celina Loyer Kasikasun. Hi, my name is Celina Loyer. I am the daughter of Kathleen Steiner, who was the daughter of Ralph Garvin Steiner and Isabel Davidson. And also my father was Gilbert Anderson, a very well-known Métis fiddler in this area. His parents were Joe Anderson and Celina Callahu. So we are going to talk today a little bit about the Indian Act. And I'm going to start right now with the disclaimer. Number one, this is definitely an overview of the Indian Act. I do not know everything about the Indian Act. I'm only going to share some aspects of it that in ways that they've affected my family. You would need a degree in law to understand it completely or be able to talk about it coherently. I'm hoping that this will be cohesive enough that you will understand just the things that I want to talk about. I'm very grateful to the library in St. Albert here, the St. Albert Public Library, for letting me use their space and their internet. And I'm also very grateful that Josh approached me to do this presentation. So there, as Josh said, there are two different things when we talk about the Indian Act versus treaty. So the Indian Act is, as Josh said, a federal government legislation to control First Nations people in Canada and to assimilate them. Those were the two main goals of the Indian Act: to control people and to assimilate them. Treaty is a formally concluded and ratified agreement entered into by two or more sovereign nations. And if you stayed awake in high school long enough, you would have heard that word before when you were learning European history, but not always when you were talking about Canada. So we're going to talk a little bit about treaties first so that you can understand the distinction between them. How did treaties come to be? Well, like I said, in other parts of the world, they were doing treaties. This map shows what is known as Turtle Island, North America, as it is known by the Anishinaabe people, Turtle Island. From time immemorial, people have lived on this land. The people that lived here are sovereign nations who've had inherent rights. And in the spaces that they occupied, often they would come into conflict with the people that were adjacent to them, or they would come into just disagreements about how things might work or what access to resources there were. And so those people would create treaties amongst themselves. So the idea of a treaty was something that was already present here in Turtle Island before anyone else turned up here. How did the Canadians Treaties come to be? Well, this is a little bit more interesting. You have to go back to 1783 to the Royal Proclamation by King Charles II, who said that the Indigenous people in North America had an inherent right to the land that they were living on, and that the people who came here had to deal fairly with them and create treaties with them for the use of their land. So that right was recognized by the British Crown prior to the treaties that were actually signed here. There were many, many different treaties signed with different individual First Nations or groups of nations. Some of them were named treaties, like the Robinson Treaty, the Peace of Friendship Treaty. There's many of them. Numbered treaties, which we're very familiar with, and even modern treaties that are being made right up until today. So this is the treaty that's most important. As Josh said, we are in the area of Treaty 6. This is an actual copy of what that treaty looks like. And I'm sure you cannot read the fine print, but this is apparently exactly what it looks like. This is the area that it covers. So like Josh said, it covers the central part of Alberta, basically from the mountains right to Saskatchewan border and across the center part of Saskatchewan as well. Treaty 7 is to the south of us. Treaty 8 area is to the north of us. But if you look on this map, there's Edmonton right there. And Treaty 6 was actually signed in 1876 at Fort Pitt and Fort Carleton in August. So we just actually had a little celebration here in Edmonton a day or two ago, celebrating the fact that it was signed. It was signed over a couple of days because it took a little while for them to negotiate what was going to happen and who was going to sign. So the Indian Act, on the other hand, is something different. And it's interesting that the ideas of what people asked for in the treaties were supposed to be acted out through what became known as the Indian Act. So how did the Indian Act come to be in Canada? Well, prior to 1876, there were many different jurisdictions and colonial laws to deal with First Nations across what we now call Canada. And it's interesting because the very first Indian Department was actually created in 1855 by the British. It was run from Britain by British people. Apparently they figured there was a problem here and they needed to deal with it. So all of these other acts and reports that I have here on this list are the legislations that were eventually gathered together. This is not a definitive list. There are many other laws and different situations that the different jurisdictions, when they formed what became known as the provinces of Canada, Upper and Lower Canada, and they put them all together. And in 1876, the Indian Act was passed. So all of that legislation was taken and put together in one document that was known as the Indian Act. This had profound impact on the people, First Nations people that were living on the land, because they had no part in the decision about what was being written into this act or about the legislation that would affect them. So there are many different sections to the Indian Act. I think it's the current version of it is 60 pages long or something like that. Many different sections. There's a whole section that's just definitions. This is what this means. This is what that means. And it deals with everything you can think of. Status, who is or who isn't an Indian, land use, governance, education, healthcare, every aspect of life that you can think of was controlled and still is to some degree by the Indian Act. So, for example, one of the most basic things is who are you as a people? The Indian Act decided who was a status Indian. So, and I'm using these terms. This is an outdated term, obviously. The word Indian is, excuse me, the word Indian is a word that I'm going to use because that is the word that is used in the Act itself. It's still called the Indian Act. The people are still called Indian people. So we have the definition of status from the Indian Act in April 12th, 1876 is any male person of Indian blood. So this is the current definition of who is an Indian person from Indigenous Services Canada website from last week. Indian status is the legal status of a person who is registered as an Indian under the Indian Act. Under the Indian Act, status Indians, also known as registered Indians, may be eligible for a range of benefits, rights, programs, and services offered by the federal and provincial or territorial governments. You notice it says may be. There's not necessarily, it's not a given that you're eligible for anything, whether you're registered. So as Josh said, this word enfranchisement is another term that I wanted to talk about, a little side note about that. Not only does the Act determine who is an Indian, it also determines who is not an Indian. Section 112 of the Act talks about a legal process for terminating a person's Indian status. So as Josh said, it is compulsory for anyone becoming a Christian clergyman, a doctor, a lawyer, or a teacher. So any post-secondary education would mandatorily make you lose your Indian status. It was also strongly encouraged. This was sort of the carrot that they wanted to dangle in front of First Nations people. They wanted them to be out from under the Indian Act. They wanted them to be assimilated into what they referred to as Canadian culture, the body politic. And the whole point of the Indian Act was to remove people from under this act and have them participate in Euro-Canadian culture in a way that other people thought was the way that they should behave. So how does this affect my family? Okay, I'm going to try to make this as not complicated as possible, but here's my family tree. So this is just a little bit confusing. So at the very bottom, you see me, Celina Anderson. I am married to Daryl Loyer. I go by Celina Loyer. My parents, as I said, were Kathleen Steiner, who was the daughter of Ralph Garvin Steiner and Isabel Davidson. Isabel Davidson was an American of Scottish descent, so she had no First Nations blood in her. My grandfather, Ralph, his father was Josiah âpahkowâyânaw, who was a descendant of Peter âpahkowâyânaw, who was the son, a descendant of Pakan, who signed Treaty 6. And Angeline Rose, his wife, was a daughter of âpahkowâyânaw, who is also known as Papas Chase. So the reason âpahkowâyânaw, and on the other side, on my dad's side of the family, we go back up the tree and we get to Michelle Callahu. The reason these two men have their names highlighted on here is because both of them were signatories to Treaty 6. So in my family tree, the line is not quite as direct for Peter âpahkowâyânaw, but I have 2 and sort of 3 ancestors who signed onto Treaty 6. So I'm going to use this graph to explain things about how my family was affected by the Indian Act based on this. Don't worry, you don't have to memorize it. It's not going to be in the test after. So one of the first things that the Indian Act also did was it defined lands. So lands set aside for the use and benefit of a band. So this is the definition. My husband works in bands. It works in lands, and so he understands these definitions very, very well. lands are defined and limited land that is set apart for the use and benefit of a band. It is owned by Her Majesty the Queen in right of Canada. There have been over time many amendments to change this very limited way of viewing the lands, but when the treaties were signed, the people were promised a certain amount of land. The enacting of how that land was set apart and how it was done through the Indian Act. And so it was not necessarily the same agreement that was made. It was not enacted the same way through the Indian Act. So a reserve, so you've heard that word reserve. This is the land that was set aside for the First Nations people. A reserve is a tract of land, the legal title of which is invested in Her Majesty, and that it has been set apart by Her Majesty for the use and benefit of a band. And it is for the use and benefit of the band as a whole, as a collective interest. So no one owns their particular land on a reserve, unless, of course, there's always an exception to everything. They have what's called a certificate of possession. And I'm not even going to get into that because that's just a whole other can of worms. But for the most part, the lands are owned collectively for the use and benefit of all the members at the discretion of the chief and council. So we're going to go back to my ancestor, âpahkowâyânaw. And you would know him better as perhaps Papa's Chase. So here's a picture of Papa's Chase. As I said, here's me. My mom was Kathleen Steiner. Her father was Ralph Garvin Steiner. His father was Josiah âpahkowâyânaw. Josiah âpahkowâyânaw's mother was Angeline Rose, and Angeline Rose was the daughter of âpahkowâyânaw and Peggy Bruno. âpahkowâyânaw was also known as Papa's Chase. He was also known as John Quinn or John Gladue. The reason why he has so many names, number one, they didn't know how to spell his name properly, I don't think. And number two, they insisted that he have a European name. And so he has more than one moniker to go by. This is a picture that is from the Glenbow of him when he was younger. There's another picture of him when he's older. There are very few pictures of âpahkowâyânaw that are around, but this one shows him as a war chief. He was a very assertive person, and that got him into a lot of trouble. So this is a map from the survey that was done in the area to set aside the land for Papa's Chase. So he signed an adhesion, âpahkowâyânaw signed an adhesion to Treaty 6 at Fort Edmonton in 1877. He signed on, and with the amount of people he had, he was told he would get so X number of pieces of land per person that he had. He got into a fight with the Indian agent right away almost, and they took away half of the people that belonged to his band. They just took them off the band list they had for him. Then they weren't going to give him the same amount of land that they originally promised him, and he got into a fight with the Indian agent about that as well. There was also a little teeny tiny problem for Papa's Chase that he had no control over, which was that right there where the star is on your screen, that's where the little fledgling city of Edmonton was starting to grow. So at that time, our friend Frank Oliver was running the show, and he felt like those Indians were way too close to town. He talked about it quite frequently. If you look articles up online, you can see articles for the Edmonton Bulletin where he talks about the fact that they are too close, and that, you know, during 1885, he was very, very upset that these people were anywhere near where they lived because it was going to be a problem. He was sure they were up to something. So Frank Oliver was very adamant at making sure that he wanted to get rid of these people who were too close to where he lived. And eventually that was the plan. They actually disbanded the whole band. They sent the different groups of people off to different areas. They took the land from them. Papa's Chase was actually offered to be moved to another reserve or to take Métis scrip, which in the end he actually took Métis scrip. So this is already one of those situations where you see that even though people knew who they were, the government didn't know who they were, and they were trying to fit them into boxes that they didn't necessarily want to be in. Papa's Chase now is actually has been working towards being recognized again as a First Nation under Chief Calvin Bruno. And he's done a lot of work at reorganizing that group and trying to get them recognized as a band again. It's been an interesting situation for them. So moving along, another one of my ancestors, Michelle Callahu. So here's Michelle Callahu. Here's a picture of him. He also signed an adhesion to Treaty 6, but he signed it in 1878. So a year late, 2 years later, after the original treaty was signed, at Fort Edmonton. He had 2 wives, one of which was Marie Patnaud. Marie Patnaud had Albert Callahu. Albert Callahu married Marguerite Gladue, had my grandmother, Celina Callahu. She hooked up with Joe Anderson, had my dad. So these are all the people that were affected by him signing an adhesion to Treaty 6. Michelle Callahu was the son of Louis Caraconte, who was a Iroquois who came west with the fur trade. Michelle's mother was a Métis woman, and both of his wives were Métis women. And that did affect who his children were and how they behaved and what they did. Here is a picture of the actual adhesion to Treaty 6 that he signed. Yes, interestingly enough, Michel spoke French very well. He spoke English enough to make himself understood. He spoke Cree, and it's most probable that he also spoke Michif as well. But you can see that he did not sign his own name here. So rather than signing him as Michel Callahu, they signed him as Michel Calistois. And this little thing here beside where he signed his name is an X, and they said his mark. So he actually signed his name with an X on this document, but it was witnessed by the person who was there. Peter Erasmus was actually the person who was the interpreter that was present. You can see that at the bottom. So this was a copy of the actual signed adhesion to the treaty. And it basically said he would agree to whatever was in the treaty and do what they wanted him to do, as long as they would do what he wanted to do. So what they did was they set land aside. So they're still talking about the issues about land. So this is from a book called Nelson's Book. Nelson was the surveyor that went out and surveyed in this area in the Western Canada, all of the different parts of the land that they were going to be setting aside for Indian reserves. So this is actually the original survey plan done by him for, as you can see, it says Michel Callahu. It was done for him in 1980. So that's what it looks like here in this beautiful survey picture. This is what the actual land looked like by 1927. So this map is based on a rural Cummings map from 1927. And you can see there's a big white square there. And it also says beside it, Callahu Indian Reserve. And there's a reason for that. And I'm going to explain that in a bit. But you can see by 1927, the entire reserve was surrounded by farmers and people who owned the land in little squares. Also beside it, you can see this angular line is the train track. This interesting little selection of lines here is the settlement of St. Albert with the river lots still on it. And down in the bottom corner, you can see that's where the city of Edmonton is. So that sort of orients you as to where we are. So a lot of amendments were made to the Indian Act over the first part of this 20th century. One of them in 1905 allowed Indigenous people to be removed from reserves near towns with more than 8,000 residents. So they could just be removed. In 1906, it also allowed for the 50% sale price of reserve lands to be given to band members following surrender of the land. Before that, the money went to the Department of Indian Affairs to be distributed by the Indian agent. So this actually allowed some of the money to go to the band members if they surrendered the land. And in 1911, they allowed municipalities and companies to expropriate portions of reserve without surrender. So basically without asking people or getting their permission, for roads, railways, and other public works to come through. Now there is a process that they have to go through differently, but at this time, those were the amendments that were made to the law to allow progress to happen. So enter into our screen my most hated enemy and yours. No, I don't want to say it like that. If you are a descendant of Frank Oliver, I apologize in advance for all the terrible things I'm about to say to you about your ancestor. But this man caused a lot of problems for my family in particular. Frank Oliver was actually born out west. And he had a different last name. He got into a fight with his family. So he took the last name Oliver and moved out to the Edmonton area. And he set up the Edmonton Bulletin, which was the first English newspaper in this area. He was very politically motivated. So he ran as an MLA for Edmonton, which was a legislative place. And then he eventually was elected as the MP for Alberta. And in that capacity of being an MP, he became the Minister of the Interior and the Superintendent General of Indian Affairs. That gave him control over First Nations people all across Canada. One of the things you have to know about Frank Oliver is he had a lot of very clear views about who he thought should and shouldn't be around. He was anti-Black. As an MP, he tried to pass a law that would prevent Black people from the United States immigrating to Canada. He also was very anti-Indian, anti-Indigenous. He did not like First Nations people. He did not want them anywhere near Edmonton. He thought that they were not using the land properly, and he felt, and he speaks very openly about it in the Edmonton Bulletin in his articles that he writes, his opinion pieces, that the Indians should be off the land and give the land over to settlers who would use it properly in a civilized manner. You can look all that stuff up. It is available online. So I do want to show you something though. He was the Superintendent General of Indian Affairs. Here is my ancestor, Michelle Callahu's little section of land. But I want to kind of go in on a close up here, and I want you to look at the fact that on this map where I've circled things, you can see there's a name on there as to who owns these little parcels of land. F. Oliver. Now it is illegal for a person who is in a public elected office to benefit from that office in any way. It was illegal back then too. But somehow Frank Oliver ended up with approximately a third of the sections of land that had originally been sold off from Michelle. And on top of that, you see this guy Playfair, his name is on there quite a few times too. He also was a buddy of Oliver's. He was in the Chamber of Commerce with him. So they're all of the names that are in this whole section that was blocked off in white on the map that I'm kind of running my mouse around in a circle. I don't know if you can see it. All of that land was sold off over time, and Frank Oliver and his buddies benefited from it. And he was never charged with anything, even though that does look rather suspicious to me. Apparently his cleaning lady got access to the land and then sold it to him for $1 or something. I don't know. It was, I don't know the details, but I'm sure that you could definitely find that out if you looked it up. So I am going to show you just a little bit over time what happened with Michelle. So here's this map again that shows where the Callahu, as it says here, Callahu Indian Reserve, it was known by various names, or the Michelle Reserve or Callahu Reserve. In 1903 and 1906, that little strip that just lit up there, that little strip was sold in two different sections. One's in 1903 and one's in 1906. The people of Michelle took treaty. They were very, very hard workers. A lot of the people were descendants of the fur trade, and so their ancestors had worked in the fur trade. They had a very good work ethic. They decided they were going to settle down. They were very good at farming. They built houses. They cultivated the land. They had a lot of animals. They were taking good care of themselves and their families. And they wanted to they had been promised under the treaty that they would receive certain farm implements and livestock, and they didn't get them. So in 1903, first in 1903, then again in 1906, the current Indian agent at the time told them, well, if you just sell this little piece of land right here, this little piece of land, you can take the money from that and you can buy farm implements and you can buy livestock for the things that you want. Even though that seemed kind of shady, somebody decided that it was a good idea and they sold a section of that land, first in 1903 and then another portion of it in 1906. They never did see the entire amount of money from the land. They did see a small amount of money from it, but it wasn't enough to buy either the livestock they wanted or the farm implements. So the Indian agent coerced them again in 1911 to sell this section of the land. And with the same or very similar results, where the land was sold, the money disappeared. The land went over to Frank Oliver and his buddies, and they still didn't receive the livestock or the farm implements that they were promised under treaty. So this was how the Indian Act was enacting what had been promised under the treaty. It wasn't working very well. One of the things that also happened was commonly, well, all across Canada, by a certain date, people who were status had to send their children to residential schools. So the people who lived in Callahu, the Callahu First Nation, would send their children over to St. Albert to the mission school on the hill, the residential school in St. Albert, also known as the Uville. By 1928, they had decided they'd had enough of that. And they were told, they actually asked the Indian agent if they could build a school on the reserve. Basically, they were ahead of their time. They were working really hard. They were farming, but they weren't getting what they needed to support them. They also wanted to have their children at home to go to school. So they were told, well, we can't build a basically we can't build a school on the reserve. But if you sell the south end of your reserve and turn it over, we can put a school on there and the kids can go to school there. So the people who sold were 10 families decided in 1928 to sell their property and to enfranchise. And they did that so that their children wouldn't have to go to the residential school. By 1958, this is I'm giving you the most skimmiest of stories to do with this. And if you want to read more about it, you can go to the Musée Héritage Museum .ca website, and we had an exhibit called the Michelle Band exhibit, and it talks more in depth about the history of this. But by 1958, all but 4 women were enfranchised from the reserve. The land was sold and the people were dispersed. Now, it was not legal to enfranchise an entire reserve at that point in 1958. So these guys in the House of Commons, here they are, all the MPs, you can notice that there is something very, very similar about all of them. They're all old white dudes, with the exception of that one lady that's sitting there. But they're all pretty, got their own sort of interests. And they were the ones that decided that they passed a law that made it legal to enfranchise an entire reserve. And so they did that with Michelle. And on April 1st, every member of the reserve, with the exception of 4 women, they were enfranchised. Oh, I see that I have a typo here. That's supposed to say enfranchisement. Okay, it is a legal process for terminating a person's status and conferring full citizenship. So I have here a copy of a certificate of enfranchisement, because obviously, even if you passed a law that said somebody wasn't an Indian anymore, they still looked the way they looked. So people who had been enfranchised were actually given a card, first of all, to show that they were an Indian, but then when they were enfranchised, they were given another card to show that they weren't an Indian anymore. So if you read the fine print on here, as of March 31st, 1958, and from that date, that Lotta Emma Callahu, formerly of the Michelle Band of Indians, is deemed not to be an Indian within the meaning of the Indian Act or any other statute or law. So there's one of my aunties, Lottie, who, that's an actual copy of her certificate of enfranchisement. So we did that. Actual enfranchisement law was considered, the enfranchising a whole band was something they had to change the law for. But the idea of a person being enfranchised as an individual was in the act from the very beginning. And it wasn't actually removed from the Indian Act until 1961. So that led to the dispersal of the people of Michelle. So that's little squares where Michelle Reserve would have been. And actually at this point, there's only one person who's descended of Michelle, who's still living on the land that his father received at the enfranchisement. He was a child at the time. Everyone else, through various means, lost access to their land that they had been given. And the money that was given to them out of that sale of that land was spent. And for the most part, they are dispersed all over the place. One of the most most difficult parts of this for most people who are members or descendants of Michelle Band is that it created a lack of community for all the descendants, and it made it very difficult for them to reconnect in former years. Michelle Band is still trying to get recognition from the government, and it's a work in progress. But it's one of those things that is a very long fight that's been going on within certain members of my family for quite some time. So turns out that what they did when they enfranchised the whole reserve was illegal. And when they got caught, the Parliament of Canada had to actually in 1959 rescind the law that they passed to enfranchise the entire reserve. Unfortunately, by that time, it was too late for the descendants of Michelle. So here's a picture of the family tree. Here's me and my husband here with our beautiful children. This is a picture of my dad with the fiddle, and this is his mom, Celina Callahu. We were basically all left hanging. So my father was raised not by his mother, Celina Callahu, but by his older half brother, who was Métis. And he was raised as a Métis person. He was raised to play Métis fiddle tunes. He was raised very deeply immersed in Métis culture. And so as I grew up in a Métis household. And I was not born with status. I self-identify as Métis because that's how I grew up. My husband comes from a very long line of Métis people. And so both of us self-identify as Métis, but this story is not over yet. So many more statutes were passed to the Indian Act and many more amendments were made. A number of very crucial amendments were made after 1870 and 1885. And it was because, well, for the most important reason was because the politicians in Ottawa got scared. Louis Riel, during his resistance, had the support of Big Bear and Palmaker. And this became a way that they used this as an excuse for tightening up the controls and making them stricter for how they were going to control First Nations people in Canada. So the Indian Act became basically more stringent. One of the things that had been not compulsory, but became compulsory after that was the pass system. It was instituted as law. They also prohibited spiritual ceremonies and dances, as Josh had said. It also formalized permits to buy and sell. So someone who was a First Nations person on reserve could not sell anything that they made as produce without a permit to sell it. They could also not go off the reserve to buy anything, clothing or groceries, anything like that, unless they had a permit to go buy something. So these were things that were very strictly controlled by the Indian agent. So the Indian agent was one person who had the power to control what happened to persons on the reserve. And there was sometimes an Indian agent for each reserve, but there was also sometimes one agent for several reserves. And so you would have to wait until the Indian agent was in your area to see if you could get a pass to go somewhere or do something. So the pass system is one of those things that people do not know very much about. This is one of the most famous passes that you will see. So this is from the Duck Lake Agency. The man's name is Edward Yayakikut. He's number 125 of Beardy's band. And you can see that he is permitted to be absent from his reserve for 2 weeks because he is hunting big game for food and he is permitted to carry a gun. It's signed by the Indian agent. So this is one pass. I am not related to this person. I don't know this person, but this is one of the more famous ones you'll see if you look them up online. This person, however, James Steiner, was my grandfather's stepdad. So this was the man who raised him. In 1941, my grandpa Jimmy from Saddle Lake was permitted, and you can see the number that's after there. It says that's his status number because they were known by their numbers. He was permitted to be absent from the reserve for 7 days. And the business says to visit something, and I can't read that. I don't know what that was supposed to say, but he is not permitted to carry a gun. Obviously, going visiting does not require a gun. And it's signed by Mr. Pugh there, the Indian agent at the time. So this is an actual direct link to my family. This is my grandfather's stepdad. So other things that were limited were the ceremonies and dances. So potlatch, Sundance, any kind of spiritual practices, any kind of cultural gathering. So as Josh said, there are over 600 different groups of First Nations people. This was just laid like a blanket across Canada. Regardless of what your ceremonies were, you were not permitted to do them. Regardless of what your cultural practices were, you were not allowed to do them. You're not even allowed to wear your regalia. It was against the law to wear regalia. However, interestingly enough, in 1914, they passed an exception which allowed the wearing of costumes. And people are kind of going, why is there an exception in 1914? Well, the Calgary Stampede started in 1912, and they wanted to have some Indians with their cowboys. So they set aside a section of the law, which referred to them being allowed to wear costumes under certain circumstances and in certain places, if they were given the permission of their Indian agent. So moving along to education, residential school system. And seriously, guys, I could talk about this one for an hour, but I'm not going to. In education was actually one of the things that was negotiated under the treaty, under Treaty 6 especially. In 1876, it became a federal responsibility. In the beginning, families were strongly encouraged to send children to residential schools. And we could get all into this, but we're not going to. But in 1920, the Indian Act made it compulsory for status Indian children between the ages of 7 to 14 to attend residential schools, regardless, period, end of story. So the two pictures that I have here, I work in St. Albert, and I talk about this all the time. I work at the Musée Héritage Museum. St. Albert was fortunate enough to have 2 residential schools, one for the Catholics and one for the Methodists. So on your screen, you can see the one that's on the left-hand side. I think it's on your left-hand side of your screen. The Edmonton Indian Residential School was the one that the Methodist and then later United Church ran. And the one that's on the right is the Uville Convent and Farm, which was the one that the Catholics went to. So my mom and her family went to the Protestant one, and my dad and his family went to the Catholic one. Not that I have any opinions on this whatsoever. But we all are starting to understand just a little bit of the legacy that led to people, led First Nations people to. Going back to the family tree, here's all these folks. We're going to kind of tie this all into who people are and where we're all going here with this. I want to talk a little bit about this whole thing has to do with who marries who and what happens to them when they get married. And it depends on what gender you are by a big way. So section 12 referred to marriage. So first of all, the Indian Act conferred status. And there were three things. First, any male person of Indian blood reputed to belong to a particular band. Secondly, any child of such a person. Thirdly, any woman who is or was lawfully married to such a person. I love it. The women come in third. Give me a break, people. Sorry about that. That just came out of my mouth. Didn't mean to say that. Anyways, that was the original definition as of 1876. So enfranchisement, section 12(1)(b) of the Indian Act made it mandatory for status women, so women who were born with status, when they got married, if they married a man who did not have status, a non-status man, they would be mandatorily, compulsorily enfranchised. They would just stop being an Indian the day they got married. Status men who married anybody, or also non-status women, did not lose their status. And if their wives were not status, their wives actually gained Indian status. So there's a sexist law right there. Also, those women who gained status from marriage retained that status even after death or divorce of the status man. And so did their children. And even if they had children after a divorce from someone else, those children became status because their mother had status. So that caused all kinds of interesting situations to happen. So let's go back to this thing. Section 12, here's my family tree, governing status. So I'm not there yet, so we're gonna get rid of me. There we go. This is my mother, Kathleen Steiner. She's the daughter of Ralph Garvin Steiner and Isabel Davidson. So as I said, Ralph Garvin Steiner was a Cree from Saddle Lake First Nation. Isabel Davidson was an American of Scottish descent. They fell in love, and when my grandmother married my grandfather, she became a status Indian. They had children, including my mother. When my mother was born, she had status at Saddle Lake, so she was Cree. When she fell in love with her first husband, Alan Smallface, and married him, her status was transferred from Cree over to the Kainai, which is where he was from. So she was automatically transferred to a different band once she married him. They lived happily for a couple of years, a little while, and had two sons, my brothers, Davy and Mark, and they were members of the Kainai tribe, the blood tribe. So all of these people were members of the blood tribe. Unfortunately, that marriage did not last. Things went down the tube and Alan was gone. And that left my mom with the two boys. She still had status and my brothers had status. Then lo and behold, my dad came along. Now my dad, as you remember, from that very complicated Michelle Band thing, he was non-status. He didn't have status. He was raised as a Métis person. And when they fell in love, my dad wanted to marry my mom and she didn't want to marry him because she knew if she married him because he was non-status, she would lose her status. And if you read this book, you can read the conversation that my parents had about, if you love me enough, do you love me enough to marry me and lose your status? So this is a book that my mom wrote along with Nellie Carlson and Linda Goyette, and I'll talk a little bit more about it in a minute. But eventually, yes, they did get married, and both myself and my little brother were born. And like I said, my dad's mom, Celina Callahu, had lost status when she married her husband, who was non-status. So my dad was born without status. I was born without status, and so was my younger brother. My mom had lost her status. My two older brothers still had status. Anybody confused yet? Okay, this is the kind of stuff that we sat around and talked about at the supper table when I was a kid, weirdly enough. And one of the things that came out of those conversations was my mom decided when she lost her status, when she married my dad, that she was going to get her rights back. And she spent 20 years doing that. So she was part of a group that founded what was known as Indian Rights for Indian Women. The three women that were most important in this activist movement were Nellie Carlson, Jenny Margetts, and Kathleen Steiner, my mom. So Nellie Carlson just passed away recently, my auntie Nellie, and she has a school named after her in Edmonton. Jenny Margetts passed away in the 90s from cancer, most unfortunate. She was such a wonderful lady. And my mom has passed away now, been gone for 10 years. But they were in this area, the founders of a group that they named Indian Rights for Indian Women. And their goal was to get back their status that they had lost through marriage. They found common cause with a whole bunch of women across Canada. And I'm only going to mention these three, but there were many, many, many women that were involved all across Canada. Mary Two Axe Early, who Mary Two Axe was from, she was a Mohawk. And when she married her husband, Mr. Early, she said that the dogs on the reserve had more rights than she did, because you could bury a dog that had lived on the reserve, but she could not be buried on the reserve after she died. That was how strict they were about access to her land. She was born on the reserve, but they were not allowing her to go back there. And another one was Jeanette Laval, who took a court case against the government of Canada. Another one was Yvonne Bedard, who also brought a court case against Canada as well. And these women were very, very strong women who worked very, very hard to change the law. And it was an uphill battle for 20 years for my mom and her friends. But in 1985, they convinced the government to pass what's now known as Bill C-31, and it changed that inherent sexism in the Indian Act. It was supposed to provide equality under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So it allowed women who had lost status by marrying a non-status person to apply for and regain status. And it also allowed their children to apply. So because my mom had been very instrumental in passing this law, she said, you're gonna apply for this and you're gonna get your status. And I was like, okay. Anyways, as you can see from the little charts here, it was not as simple as it looks. And it was supposed to change that inherent sexism with the Indian Act, but it really only worked theoretically because it only worked to a certain degree. More amendments had to be passed. Sharon McIver took the government to court in 2011, and they passed Bill C-3, which allowed the grandchildren of some of those people who had lost status to gain status again. You need a lawyer's degree just to figure some of that out. That's just some of the skimming over of some of the topics that have affected me personally as a Métis person who also has status. I self-identify as Métis. That's the culture I was raised in. That's the culture I live in. I do have status. It has not brought me a whole heck of a lot of anything really fantastic, but there it is. I've had all kinds of suggestions about what we should do with the Indian Act, and you can see some of them here, burning it up, throwing it in the garbage, shooting it in a rocket off to space. But really, it's an interesting subject because if you abolish the Indian Act, what happens to the people whose lives are affected by that act, who are supposed to have certain rights given to them under their agreement with the government? What happens to those people if there isn't a way to enact those rights? And if you live on a reserve, how those privileges and rights and benefits, so-called, are passed on differently than people who don't live on a reserve. So it's a very, very complicated issue. It's not something that's going to be easily solved in any way. I'm going to end my slideshow there and just kind of go back to the screen and see if there's anybody that has any ideas about what questions or things that they want to ask. I do want to really promote this book. And I can see my background is making it really, really bad for anybody to see it there. I don't know how I can make it any better, but this book is called Disinherited Generations. Oh my goodness, it's terrible. I gotta take my background off here. Let me see if I can figure out how to do that without hurting myself.
Here, I can share a slide where it shows.
Can you share a slide? Thank you, Josh, because it's like disappearing into the background.
I gotta.
I brought the book and everything. Anyways,
I
this
know
is
it
what the
happens
book
to
looks
me
like.
all the time too.
Disinherited Generations. It's written by Linda Goyette, sat down with Nellie Carlson and my mom over a number of years and read,
Oh, now I'm
wrote
all
this
the way at
book
the
based on
beginning.
it. Yeah, but this is, anyways, that's what the book looks like. You can order it on Amazon. You can get it from your library, your public library. Most libraries should have a copy.
There we
of it.
go.
There it is,
There.
Disinherited Generations. And it is really, it's written in very simple language. It's as if you're sitting in the kitchen at my kitchen table with my mom and Auntie Nellie listening to them talk. And I'm getting choked up thinking about that. But it is very important to read this and understand this. There's a lot of different places. Like I said, you can buy it online. If you really want to own it, you can borrow it from the library. There's a number of different ways that you can get copies of it. I don't know.
Look
if
at that. I
they've got
actually
an
see.
ebook. Yeah.
Is that
you
Brett
go.
Lamoureux? And get the book at the Musée Héritage Museum gift
Yes,
shop. Yes,
that's
awesome
true.
suggestion. Because yeah, that's actually a great idea.
Yeah, it is available here in St. Albert, Place. You can run out and buy it from the museum. It's
Yeah.
right there. Yep,
That's cool.
absolutely. Oh, it's apparently it's also on our resource list. So does anybody have, I don't know, I haven't been monitoring the chat. Do we have any questions from anybody that I might be able to answer?
Yeah, if anyone has any questions or comments, now's the time to shoot them over. I'm sure Kayla has some written down, but yeah, we got time for some more for sure. I see some participants too. Some have raised hands. So I don't know if you want to type your question in or if you have a comment, you can definitely put that, but I'll move it over to Kayla right now.
We had a question earlier from someone in the chat named Dawn, and they were wondering if the âpahkowâyânaw were part of the Edmonton stragglers.
So the Edmontons, originally the followers of âpahkowâyânaw, remember I said that a group of them were sort of taken away from them. The Indian agent actually created the group called the Edmonton Stragglers from that group that were following âpahkowâyânaw. That's the short answer. If you want to get into the history of that, you would have to actually do the research into it. But that group that he created, the Indian agent created, was what became known as the Edmonton Stragglers. Okay. Does that answer your question, Dawn?
Yeah, sorry, Kayla, but it's interesting. I know the one Métis researcher, Jennifer at DC, she said she was going to try to dedicate some time on researching the Edmonton stragglers, because just as you kind of put it, Celina, it's like to really grasp it, you have to like literally research it in that sense, right? Yeah. And she's in the position where she thinks she can. I don't know when she'll get to it, but yeah, hopefully more information gets put out for sure.
There is on the City of Edmonton website, there is some reference to âpahkowâyânaw, and I know that they have their own, a separate website. So if you wanted more information on that, you would probably want to look that up.
We have another question from Cody, and they're wondering how long did the pass system last?
The pass system, I think, was rescinded in 1961, 51. I think it was rescinded in 51. But it was in effect from the time that the Indian Act was started. So by 1960, First Nations men had gained the right to vote in federal elections without losing status. And so by that time, for sure, it had been completely rescinded. But it was still, it's interesting because when people live a certain way for generations, it becomes very difficult for them to make decisions on their own. And so for a lot of First Nations people, it became very difficult for them to accept that they were given the ability to go where they wanted when they wanted. And so sometimes it was still, some of the effects of that pass system lingered for probably a good 10 years or more afterwards because of that.
We have a question from TJ, wondering a little bit more about C3.
Okay.
They said the new changes were a few years back for First Nations non-status and Métis recognition.
Okay, so Bill C3, if you really want to know if you are eligible under Bill C3, you need to go to the INAC website, or whatever they're called now, ISC, Indigenous Services Canada, and look at the definition they have on there. I I know about it, but I don't know enough about it to give you an answer about if you're eligible as a person. Like I couldn't tell you. It's you have to actually follow the directions on how to apply for it to find out about that. So what it did was it actually just extended the ability to apply for status one generation further than Bill C-31 did. So rather than just the women who had lost status and their children, it allowed their grandchildren, but only after a certain date. It provided a date as a baseline date where you could only go back to. So in some families, even some children can apply, but other children cannot because they were born before that date. Go figure. And these laws are changing even today as we speak. There are amendments being made and cases that are before the courts that are working towards changing different aspects of this. So it changes from time to time.
Well, yes, so that ties into this next question from Cheryl Dumont, wondering how do the Truth and Reconciliation calls to actions affect possible changes to the Indian Act?
Fundamentally, perhaps, shall we say, really a person would have to go through the calls to action from the TRC and realize that everything that has to do with the calls for different levels of government, especially the federal government, should be impacted by those calls to action. As we very well know, most of those calls to action have not been either acted on or fully enacted for sure. We're all working on it from our end and hopefully from their end as well. Mind you, we're in the middle of an election, so who knows what's happening, right? I said I wasn't going to get political. I'm going to cut it right there. Okay.
But that shows though an interesting perspective for us as Indigenous peoples, right? Where like which party comes in, we kind of have to maneuver that way in a sense.
Exactly. Exactly.
There are a couple too. I don't know if you've seen them in the Q&A part, Kayla, but there was one from Sue who asked, are you aware if other countries have similar legislation such as the Indian Act pertaining to Indigenous cultures, which that's a pretty good question, actually.
The most famous one that most people would be familiar with is apartheid in South Africa, which is a very, very similar type of legislation. As well, the Aboriginal people in Australia were seriously constrained by a lot of the legislation. It wasn't, I can't remember how their legislation is globbed together, but all of it, the Aboriginal people of the Aborigines in Australia were definitely subject to residential schools. They were subject to being put onto smaller little pieces of land. All of those things were things that basically anywhere that the British or colonizing agents went, they enacted what they thought was the best idea for getting a hold of these people that were in their way while they were trying to take over these countries. So, and I mean that in the most loving way possible if you're British, but the truth of the matter is that when colonizing forces came through, they had a very distinct idea about how things should be. And they had a very distinct way about how the people that were already occupying the spaces they were in should be. And they used the law to do their best to erase those cultures and to impose upon them a template of their own belief system and culture. And that's had a very long lasting effect for communities all around the world. Does that answer your question?
I think that was great response. Just before we get back into the chat questions, I don't know how much we have. I just want to make sure we get the anonymous attendee. I know they were right after Sue. They were saying the government really forced these internalized beliefs onto our people where they become fixated on who's who, where it's created lateral violence. How can we teach youth about this in a simple manner? Okay, and that's good. And before Celina gets in, I will say there are lists of really great children's books out there that do discuss like things on Indian Act, residential schools, even like there's a story on road allowance for the Métis road allowance kitten in that sense. So definitely just like even if you Google like children's books, like I think CBC has some. Even you'll be able to find some good lists.
Yeah, CBC Indigenous has a great list of kids books, but also adult books or in between books. So they've had people that work for them put together lists of reading lists. There's a lot of different books that as an adult you can read. So Indian Horse is one. You can read Disinherited Generations. You can read 21 Things to Know About the Indian Act. You can read Seven Fallen Feathers by Tanya Tulaga. All of those are effects of the Indian Act on different people and their cultures. And how it's interesting when you talk about internalizing how people believe. One of the things that was a very important part of residential schooling was that they taught the children that being Indian was bad and being brown was bad, and that learning that talking in that language was bad. It was of the devil. These were very negative stereotypes that they put on these very, very young children who were in the schools. And those children internalized those feelings and those thoughts. So they would go back to their communities and not be able to interact properly with their families because they had been internalizing all of this negativity at school. Not only did they do that, but their children did that, and their children's children. So it wasn't just one generation it happened to, it was multiple generations that were told who you are is bad. And so, like you said, they internalized that. How do we teach our children, the next 7 generations, to love themselves? That's the job that all of us have. And I think it's not just to teach my children and my grandchildren or whoever. I think I have a responsibility to teach them to love themselves. My parents taught me to love myself, who I am. It's not an easy journey when you're brown. But I think it's important that all children be taught that they have worth, regardless of what they look like, how they feel, how they see themselves, where they're at. Every child is important. Every child is a gift. And when we start really believing that, then I think we'll see the world change just a bit. Now I'm getting on my soapbox here. Okay, let's have another question here.
Jeff is wondering if the Indian Act influenced apartheid. Wondering if that's true.
Did the Indian Act influence apartheid? No, I don't think that it was necessarily that in the Indian Act influenced apartheid. Different colonizing forces around the world had a similar game plan for how they would see how, say, the British were doing it, or the French were doing it, or how the people from Belgium were doing it. And they would take cues from them and use their systems and impose that system on whatever they were doing. So the most common one is when you look at any place that the British went, their schools all look the same. The system of education was the same. How they separated people into different groups was the same. They used the same template, but in different places all over the world, on people who were vastly different from them and from each other.
Mm-hmm. We have another question from Cody here. When children were taken and adopted outside of their community during the 60s scoop, did those kids all lose their status?
Did the kids that were taken on communities lose their status? Yes and no. For the most part, yes. Some of them have regained status under Bill C-31, some have not. And a lot of them have a very, very hard time connecting with their community of origin, because sometimes the information is not available to them. And even when the information becomes available to them, it just is very difficult sometimes for them to be integrated back into their communities, because they have been raised in a way that's completely different from the way that their age mates in the same age that have never left the community were raised. So it's a difficult situation for those people who are trying to reclaim who they are. For the most part, they lost their status though.
Mm-hmm. We have a question from Monique. What would be a question you'd ask a political candidate? How can we engage our elected representatives?
You can ask them what their stance is on fresh water in Indigenous communities. You can ask them what their stance in this area, in the Edmonton area. You can ask them what's their stance on having the Department of Defense come on to Enoch and clean up the mess they made during the Second World War when they were bombing on the reserve and left bombs behind and live ordnances dropped on the reserve. You can ask what is that person's, I mean, you'll get some pretty direct answers about, you'll see where people sit quite quickly when you ask them a direct question like that. You can ask, what do they see their part, what is their party's platform concerning Indigenous relations across Canada? Those are the kind of questions you can ask. Some of them, you don't have to be very specific, but you'll know within a sentence or two what their idea is about it.
Mm. And I think we just have time for one last question here.
Okay.
From Carla, wondering how would one go about starting to research their bloodlines?
How would one go about researching their bloodlines? Okay, so I am not an advocate of getting your DNA sold to a public company, but that is how some people do it. If you know anything in your family tree, if you know who your birth parents are, that would be your first place to start. Figure out what communities they were from, try to make contact with that community, try to find someone from that community and start very humbly to say, you know, this is who I come from. A lot of times those communities will know who those children are that were taken. It's often known that which families were having difficulty, which kids went missing, which kids were taken. And so it starts there. That's where it starts. Don't necessarily hope that you're going to find your community online. That's not necessarily the best way to do it. Best way to do it for me, in my opinion, is to make contact with a person one-on-one and have a discussion with them about who you are and where you come from. And be humble about it. You know, say, this is where I don't know who I am, but I'm willing to learn. That's where you would start with that. That's my advice. I can't speak for anybody else. I was raised in my culture, so it's hard for me to think about having to be in that position. I know that I've talked to a lot of different people who are trying to connect with their culture and just spent time with them and talked to them and answer questions for them. Because to me, it's important that those people that didn't have a choice, that were taken away, be allowed to come back and be allowed to start to know who they are. Because it's really, you can't be yourself till you know who you are.
Thank you so much for your answers.
Yeah, no, that was really wonderful. And that's a very important point, because even with my work, I find lots, I'll encounter folks who are reconnecting. And as you put it, you know, the way I've always explained it is it's like when you're in high school and you're trying to figure out who you are, where you fit in, like, what are you going to do for work? Like, where am I going to fit in society? What, like, you're even still figuring out what you like in a lot of cases. And a lot of times for folks who are reconnecting, they're kind of stuck in that feeling of where do I fit in the regard. But in this case, it's almost like it's festered because it's been with them for so long. So kind of as Celina put it, you know, if we're folks who are raised within the community, we try our hardest to make ourselves accessible in certain ways. So folks who are reconnecting, they have these questions, they have a safe space with a safe person they can do so with. You know, and me and Celina can speak for this for anyone. You know, if any of you ever come and say reach out to us or want to talk to us about anything, it's a safe circle, and what's said in our circle stays in our circle, kind of thing. We're always very big advocates of that. Yeah, no, I think that was a really very important point, and I apologize if there's any more questions, of course. You know, but I'm also very grateful that there was a lot of questions, and I'm very appreciative of all the feedback. I just want to say merci to everyone who attended this event, and merci to Celina for sharing her wonderful knowledge on this topic. And you know, I was reading some comments from some people that you know, as I could say, it's not just personal to us, but it was definitely personal to some folks in the comment section. So I just want to thank all of you for attending. And you know, we're also big advocates of, you know, if any of you have any kind of emotions or anything that come from these kind of events, absolutely reach out to someone you trust, or even possibly a professional in that case. But also too, as we put it, if you're someone who's reconnecting and you just have a question or anything like that, me and Celina, we are quite easily available to get a hold of. Celina's at the Musée Héritage Museum, and I have my email right there, indigenous@crrf.com, if you need to get a hold of me. And if you're interested in any other sessions like today, if you enjoyed today and learned a lot, our second session will be on September 14th with Dr. Pam Roach, and that one is already open for registration. So you can email either indigenous@cfrac.com or even info@cfrac.com, and we'll make sure to send you that link for the registration. So of course, I just want to say once again, Marseille, for everyone who attended today. This was our first launch of the Indigenous education session. So there's always a little bit of, I don't know, I get a little like, oh, is it going to go good in that sense, but just very appreciative of everyone who showed up today and all the questions that were asked. And I only look forward to hosting more sessions like these with the Center for Race and Culture. So yeah, once again, just want to say Marseille, hi, and in our language, we don't say goodbye, we'll say see you again in that regard. So I hope to see you again at the next session, and we would say it like Kwapamatin Mina, which is like see you again. So yeah, Marseille.
Okay, thanks for having me, Josh. I really enjoyed it. Thanks to the Center for Race and Culture for having me come on. And thank you to St. Albert Public Library. Shout out to the library, love libraries, for letting me use their space. Also, get the book, read the book. It's good for you. Also, I am a big advocate of reading to learn. And so like get out there and educate yourself. Honestly, it's the best favor you can ever do yourself. And
Yes.
I just want to say again, thank you and have a good day, everybody.
And we will have a post survey that we'll send out. So we'll send out the survey, and any feedback is always appreciative for our session, so we can make it better for the viewers, of course, in that sense. So yeah, no, thank you so much. As Celina said, thank you so much to Celina, and also to shout out to the St. Albert Public Library. They're located in the same building as the Musée Héritage Museum. So if you go to the Musée Héritage Museum, bounce back and visit the St. Albert Public Library. I think that's it.
Thanks, everyone.
We'll see you next session. Bye-bye.
Bye.
I was gonna say if I can figure out how to stop. There we go. End. Okay, I'll see everyone later.